welcome. Welcome to Nextier and to Development Discourse. Nextier is a group of advisory firms, and Development Discourse is a platform that this group of firms use in bringing important development questions to an elite audience to investigate and explore. These firms include Nextier Power, that's run by Emeka, who's brought us together today. Nextier SPD, that's run by Ndo, I don't see him around, and Advisory, that I run. The event today is hosted by Nextier Power, but we're pleased to present this discourse on nuclear power through the support of Energy Growth Hub. Nextier is a partner of Energy Growth Hub. The Hub is a non-profit research network of scholars around the United States, Europe, Asia, Africa, dedicated to the idea that people do not just deserve a high energy future, and not just a future where we get light in our homes, but where people and companies have all of the energy necessary to create jobs, grow the economy, and live very fulfilled lives. To moderate this discussion today is Emeka Okpukpara, who runs Nextier Power. He, until recently, was a special advisor to the former Minister of Power and continues to provide great leadership for Nextier Power. But we're very pleased to have Jessica, who's a doctoral student in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Her research focuses on how commercial nuclear trade affects international security standards and how very small nuclear reactors could be deployed on microgrids. She's also a fellow with Energy Growth Hub, looking at how advanced nuclear can be deployed in sub-Saharan Africa. She was formerly the director of energy program at the Breakthrough Institute, a pioneering research institute changing how people think about energy and the environment. Her work at Breakthrough sought policies to spur innovation in nuclear power technologies to drive down costs and accelerate deployment as part of a solution to create climate change and economic development. She has a bachelor's degree in astrophysics from University of California, Berkeley, and a master's degree in energy policy from the University of Colorado. Please, a round of applause for her. I'll hand it over to Emeka to kick off the discussion, but just to say that I'm keenly interested in the discussion today. I'm not sure where I stand on the debate. I think I'm more of a skeptic than a proponent for nuclear power. I just wanted to put it out there. But I'm hoping that by the end of today, I'll be a convert, and that we'll see how we can safely deploy nuclear power, or at least add it to the debate we're having in Nigeria. So a round of applause for Emeka as he takes it.
When we first got this idea to do this event, most people would say, why nuclear? Why not focus on what you have? You're not already using it. But it's important to look at the mix from a long run and a short run point of view. So I'm very excited that Jessica agreed to make this presentation. So she'll take the next 20 to 25 minutes to present these ideas. Then we'll go into a moderated conversation for another half an hour. And then we'll be left to you, the audience, to ask insightful questions. So a round of applause to Jessica, please.
Thank you, Emeka, and thank you so much to Nextier for hosting me. This is my first time in Nigeria, and I just wanted to preface by saying that I am an expert on advanced nuclear technologies and how countries have used nuclear in their industrialization pathway and to spur economic development, but I am not an expert on the Nigerian power sector, so I really encourage a lot of tough questions when we get to that point. I love skepticism, love engaging with it, so don't feel shy about asking hard questions. So on that note, I think we'll hop right in. And I did want to say I will put up my contact information at the end, so if you have more questions about some of the specifics that I go into, I'm really happy to answer questions by email after this. So, all right. Okay, so should Africa adopt nuclear energy, or should it be part of the conversation? So we typically associate nuclear power with some of the largest and wealthiest countries in the world. Got really kicked off right after World War II. But there are over 30 countries that operate commercial nuclear power plants today. And a lot of them built their first plants pretty early in their economic development. In particular, in South America, you have Argentina and Brazil, China and India, Iran, Mexico, Pakistan, South Africa, of course. And the reason that they wanted to build nuclear, even though it was a tough project to finance, is that nuclear can be really helpful in spurring economic development because it's a very large scale source of energy and it is very cheap in the long run for the electricity. So if you want to have a lot of factories, a lot of manufacturing, nuclear can be very good for powering that. So it's very similar to hydro in its economic effects. Some of the other benefits of nuclear power that I think are relevant in the sub-Saharan African context is fuel security. So a lot of the countries that you've seen pursue nuclear power, the reason is that they didn't have a lot of their own domestic fossil fuels. So if you don't have coal, if you don't have a lot of natural gas, or you don't have enough for your country, uranium is very dense, and even if you have to import it, it's much, much easier than importing a lot of coal and a lot of natural gas. So fuel security is a big one. They said low cost over time, and then also it's air pollution and water pollution benefits. So now there's a lot of focus on nuclear power in Western countries because it's carbon free. It doesn't emit any greenhouse gases, but also just locally it doesn't produce any soot or particulates, and so it's a lot better. It makes a better neighbor than, say, a big coal plant or biomass plant. And the last one, this is sort of a new topic, but nuclear can be really good outside of the power sector. So nuclear produces a lot of heat that generally is just wasted. And right now we're not taking advantage of that. But there are a lot of nuclear companies that are looking at designing, or they are designing plants that can also be used for process heat. So that's, you can use that in a lot of chemical manufacturing, oil refining, things like cement, and a lot of high heat processes, paper, pulp. There's a lot of industries that need process heat. And then some of the other electric use or non-electric uses are desalination is a big one. That has been used a lot with nuclear. So it's not just about producing electricity, but that's sort of the main benefit and the main reason why people want nuclear. But to make it more economic, looking at some of these non-electric uses are going to be important going forward. Now, there are some big challenges with nuclear. I'm sure you know or are familiar with a lot of them. The main one with nuclear is its high upfront cost. So it's very expensive before you get it finished, but then it does produce cheap electricity over the long run. But that high upfront cost is really hard. It's really hard to finance. And there's other reasons that financing nuclear is even more difficult, which I will go into. Because these projects have been so big and so expensive, you really do need a good, stable governance system to manage the regulation, the financing, the construction, things like that. Human capital can also be a challenge. In particular, nuclear power plants employ a lot more people than any other type of power plant, which sounds like a good thing. A typical nuclear power plant might employ 1,500 people. Whereas, at least in the US, I know the numbers, for a natural gas plant, it can be as low as 6 people at any time. And so it's really good for local economies, but also you need to train all those workers, all those engineers, all those security guards. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. And then, of course, weapons proliferation is a concern, and what to do with the spent fuel or the nuclear waste. And I will talk a little bit about all of those. Okay. So zooming in on Africa, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the sort of global regulator for nuclear power, they're also a promoter of nuclear power. They have a categorization of countries that are pursuing commercial nuclear power, and it's a process that they help with. And according to their categorization on the map here, Those are the countries that they have officially pursuing nuclear power. And there's different levels, whether you have at the top reactors under construction. The only one you can see there, it's not in Africa, but United Arab Emirates has 4 1.4 gigawatt reactors under construction right now. But most of the countries are in North Africa and the Middle East that are farthest along here. But if you look a little deeper at countries that have memorandum of understanding or memorandum of cooperation with some of the big nuclear vendors, it's a little broader, and you have more countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So Ghana, Kenya, Namibia, Nigeria, South Africa, Sudan. So there's a lot more kind of growing interest, not as official, but they're starting to do sort of missions with the IAEA, do a lot more convening of getting the conversation started of what would it really take. But it's a question, and I get asked this a lot, of how feasible is it really and how long will it take? Is this something in 10 years or 20 years? How feasible is it really? So I know this is probably hard for you to see, so I will summarize it. But there's a really good study done by this academic Jessica Jewell in Sweden, and what she looked at is a bunch of different metrics for motivation and capacity for countries. So as I mentioned, there's about 40 countries that are categorized as pursuing nuclear power, and these are countries that want to have nuclear eventually. And what she did is she looked at all of them on different metrics. So for capacity, she looked at size of their economy, are they able to finance a nuclear power plant? Size of their grid, could their grid actually fit a nuclear power plant? And also workforce, governance stability, a bunch of metrics, and kind of categorize the countries by how much capacity they had to build. In particular, she was looking at 1 gigawatt nuclear power plants, so very large 1,000 megawatt plants. And she also looked at the motivation for these countries. So if they don't have a lot of domestic fossil fuels, that's pretty high motivation. If they have really high growth in energy consumption, that's a good motivator. And what she found is there's this small group of countries in the top right that are sort of the most likely, and in there you do see United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. Those are countries that are already starting to build their first plants. And Nigeria is here in this black cloud, where it says nuclear power development uncertain. And in particular in the paper, what she says is that they definitely have the capacity and the motivation, but it's probably going to take some international cooperation to get a plant built. And that is what you're seeing in Nigeria. So it's not that it won't happen, it's that it'll probably be more in a partnership than starting up from scratch. And there's actually a really good process to help countries get ready for their first nuclear power plant. So the IAEA, again, this international regulator, has this milestones process. So there's a lot of things that you need in place before you can have a large nuclear power plant. You need an independent regulator. You need to have a government that has a policy position saying, we are going to have nuclear power, here's how it's going to work, here's how the tariffs are going to work, things like that. And you also need to kind of lay out how the business is going to work, how you're going to train your workforce. And so the IAEA has a set of 19 milestones that they make sure countries go through and check off before they're ready to take their first bids for projects. And Ghana has actually completed all of the infrastructural milestones. So they're moving pretty far along. Nigeria has started this process. They've had a few missions with the IAEA to kind of lay out where the gaps are, where the challenges will be, but they're getting started on that as well. And one of the big infrastructure issues that I'm sure a lot of you probably have concerns about, but of course the IAEA is also really wants to make sure that countries get this right, is security and safeguards. So what safeguards mean, that's in relation to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they want you to have good security and inspections in place to make sure that no nuclear material gets taken from the commercial sector and used for weapons material. And if you are really interested, we can talk more about that. But I will say that across Africa, that's actually one of the brightest spots. It's almost universal ratification of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and also ratification of the additional protocols, which are even stricter standards for inspections and security around nuclear facilities. There's also most of the countries that are interested in nuclear in Africa have also signed the Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty. So there's really good adherence and say enthusiasm about these security treaties, and they're actually in force. So that's a really good sign to the IAEA that these countries are really committed to security and would allow inspectors to come in. Okay, but what I see as the biggest obstacle for nuclear in newcomer countries is cost. But why that's kind of ironic, and I'll show here, is that nuclear, again, is pretty cheap for generating electricity in the long run. So what this graph shows is the International Energy Agency, every 5 years, puts out a report estimating how much it'll cost to generate electricity from new power plants. And they look at all the regions around the world. They do really detailed estimates, and they put together these numbers. So what this shows is the levelized cost of electricity. So that's how much, a kilowatt hour costs over the lifetime of a plant from combined cycle gas turbines, coal, and nuclear. And what you can see here is these are different discount rates, so sort of how much it costs to finance the project. But if you have very generous financing, so whether it's state support or from a large international financing institution, you might have a better rate. So there, nuclear is really cheap in the long run. And as you start to get more expensive financing, it sort of becomes on par with the gas and coal. And these are global numbers, so it really depends on how much gas and coal cost in your region, how much it costs to transport them, and also how much it costs to build a nuclear power plant in your region. But globally, nuclear is quite competitive. And when we dive into by countries, I know you can't read these numbers, but let me just say that what this chart does is it breaks down all the different cost components of nuclear electricity. So building the plant, fueling the plant, operations and maintenance, and also decommissioning, dealing with the waste, and financing. Did I say financing? And breaks all those costs out, and also by countries that are currently building nuclear power plants or planning to build them. And what I just wanted to point out was that in countries that have large state-owned banks or state-supported banks or just really strong state support for financing nuclear power plants, their costs are really low. So this is China. And it doesn't really change that much with the different financing structures because they just have really generous financing no matter what. So the costs in China can be about a third of what they are in the US, and most of that has to do with financing and also supply chain, which we can talk a little bit more about. So why financing is so important is that almost all of the cost of the nuclear power plant is upfront. And what that means is you're paying 2/3 of the cost of generating electricity before you even turn on the plant and actually start making any kind of revenue. So that can be really hard. It's even in the US very difficult for any utility to do right now, to be able to finance such a large project and then wait 5 years before you start seeing a revenue. Energy is really important to a country's economic development. So you might think that some of these big international financial institutions would want to help with that the way they've done with hydro or transmission infrastructure or now renewables, because it does pay back really well in the long run. As I said, the electricity is really cheap once you get it built. But, and this is a very big and important but, almost all of these financing institutions prohibit or exclude nuclear power investment from their portfolios. We can talk a little bit more about why that is. And also for a lot of climate financing or clean energy funds, they also won't let you fund nuclear. And a big reason for this is that in the past, particularly in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of nuclear power projects that were really, really expensive, didn't have good project management, they went over on costs, and they were really risky for the investors. So that's a reason that these banks don't really want to fund these projects, but they're funding a lot of renewable energy projects, which also have similar risks. And what I want to talk a little bit more about is how nuclear technology is really changing right now. It's getting a lot smaller. It's getting more factory built rather than being built on site like a construction project. And how is that changing the risk portfolio for investors? And maybe that should be a motivator to change some of these big banks' policies around nuclear. If it starts to look a lot more like a wind farm or a combined cycle gas turbine, then maybe it should be financed in a similar way. Okay, so this is what I'm most excited to talk to you about, and what I'll focus the rest of my presentation on is what a broad term called advanced nuclear. And it's a lot of different things, and they have different benefits in different places where they would work well, some places where they wouldn't work well, but there's just a lot more opportunities out there that I think people don't know about. And so the big one that maybe some of you have heard of is small modular reactors. So these are very similar in the technology to the big light water reactors that we have today, like that are operating in South Africa. They're just very small. So typically we say anything under 300 megawatts, but they can get down to 50 megawatts. So that's more kind of on the scale of a small town or a large manufacturing facility. And what's key about making them smaller, it doesn't just make them cheaper to build, but it allows them to be produced in a centralized facility. So the idea is rather than have this big kind of infrastructure project or construction project that you build, each one is unique and different, you have these reactors kind of coming off the assembly line, shipped to wherever they're going to be deployed, and we say sort of plug and play. It's a lot more like how modern gas turbines are built. You kind of order it out of a catalog, in 6 months it gets delivered and you plug it in. And there's a lot of interest in those, a lot of companies in the US, in Europe, but also China, Russia, South Korea, all working on design. So in the US, we have our first actual project is starting construction in about 3 years. And you also have the South Korea small modular reactor is called SMART, and they're partnering with Saudi Arabia to do their first demonstration project, very likely. So these are getting started and starting to be demonstrated, that business model. Another design is high temperature gas cooled reactors, and I won't talk too much about those, but what people really like about them is they produce a lot of high quality process heat. So China has a pair of these that they've built. They use in their sort of inland industrial areas to partner with factories to use that heat. And the other really nice thing about them is that they don't use any water for cooling, so they're better for arid regions and a lot more places where you don't have sort of a big ocean or a river that you can cool your reactor with. Last one is, or second to last, is pebble bed modular reactors, and I wanted to touch on this one because it's one of the only advanced reactor technologies that was really developed on the African continent. So South Africa was a big player in developing this technology, and it uses these little, they look kind of the size of tennis balls or golf balls, fuel pellets that are really stable and secure. And they go through the reactor for a long time, and the big benefit of this design is that there's no way that there can be any sort of meltdown or reactor accident. We say that they're walk-away safe. So really what that means is everyone who works at the plant could just take off, there could be an earthquake, there could be a flood, and the reactor just shuts down and cools itself naturally. And that has a lot of benefits if you're worried about safety, but also makes them simpler to run and cheaper in the long run. And the last one that I want to touch on is microreactors. So this sounds similar to small modular reactors because they are very small, but they're even smaller. So microreactor is typically 1 to 10 megawatts. So that is so small that in the US at least, a large office building can consume about 1 megawatt. So this is really getting down to kind of not just neighborhood scale, but like a single customer could buy one of these. And the big thing about them is they would be factory produced like an SMR, but they're also much, much easier to transport. And so a single one could fit in a shipping container, on a barge, on a rail car, and be shipped to the site. And one of the really big benefits, particularly I think for newcomer countries and also remote locations, is that they come fully fueled and you never refuel them for the lifetime. So they last 10 to 30 years, depending on what you want them for. But they come with the fuel in them. They're fully sealed, so you can't get inside even if you wanted to. And then when they're done, the company comes and takes them back to a central facility to handle that fuel. So if you don't want to, if you're a country that's maybe smaller and doesn't want to deal with fuel processing, with dealing with that waste and knowing where to put it and how to secure it, this is a much better model. And both microreactors and small modular reactors kind of open up new business cases and new deployment models for nuclear. So one of those is floating nuclear power, which I'll talk about. I think I have that on its own slide. Oh, yeah. So new deployment models. So when you start to get really small reactors, you can do different things with them. So one of them is floating or offshore nuclear, which I have a second slide on. Microreactors are not just a technology, but also a model. So when you have them so small that, you know, a large industrial firm could just buy one instead of a diesel generator, and own and operate it themselves. And that's a very different deployment model than when you think about nuclear in the past. A business model that's really been sort of dominated by the Russian nuclear industry is called build, own, operate. So this is where a foreign company, or I guess it doesn't have to be foreign, but they are in charge of building the power plant, but they also continue to own it and operate it and just sell the electricity. So this hasn't been done too much, but Russia has been offering it to a lot of countries, like in Turkey, this is their plan, and really the host country signs an agreement to purchase a certain amount of power at a certain price in the long term. So this can be great for countries that are worried about the financial risk because you're agreeing to pay a certain price for that electricity for a long time. So if the project goes over budget or it's delayed, it's not your concern. That also gives the vendor a lot of motivation to get the project built on time and on budget. And the last thing is a lot of these advanced reactor designs are looking at not just selling electricity, as I mentioned. So whether it's desalinating seawater for drinking water, industrial process heat, things like fertilizer production, oil refining, or making hydrogen fuel. More of these advanced reactor companies are looking at designing their power plant to do both, so electricity and another product. And that gives them more revenue and makes it sort of more economic to do these. And this is just a picture. This is a micro-reactor company, Holos, that's out of, I think it's out of Sweden, that they're designing the whole power plant, not just the reactor, but also the steam turbine, to be transportable in a single shipping container. So that opens up where you could build nuclear power plants to a lot more places. Okay, floating and offshore, you get the idea. The first commercial floating plant is actually coming online this year. It was built in Russia, and they carried it on this big barge up towards the Arctic Ocean. So it's powering an off-grid community there and replacing a bunch of diesel generators that they had. And the big benefit of these is that it really uniforms the siting process. So rather than have to worry about the local geography, are there earthquakes, is there flooding, what's the ground like? Because it's floating, it's very uniform. So it makes it much faster to build the exact same reactor over and over again. It also means you could build it in a central facility, like Russia in this case, and then transport it on the ocean to where it would be. And since a lot of major cities are on the coast, this would be a good model for coming to bring in new electricity really fast, because you come and bring it up to a port and plug it in. And this would probably operate on a build, own, operate model, so you'd just be selling the electricity to the host. There's also, besides Russia, South Korea is really big on this idea, so is China, and the US also has a few designs. US and South Korea are looking more at offshore models, so it wouldn't be docked right next to the coast. It would be more like really like an offshore oil or gas extraction site. So if maybe more than a mile off coast, you'd have a big facility, and you'd have to run a power line to the coast. Okay. So I mentioned micro reactors, and I think I've touched on a lot of these, but some of the kind of first markets for these, this is actually what I'm studying in my last year of my PhD, is how you could deploy these on microgrids and for off-grid communities. And particularly, there's a lot of interest from off-grid industry, so whether it's mining sites, oil and gas extraction, there's a lot of interest from mines in Canada and Australia, where they're very far from the grid. They pay a lot for electricity. It's all diesel. And there's a lot of insecurity around their electricity. You know, if the diesel shipment doesn't come, that means a lot of lost business for them. So they're willing to pay that high upfront cost to get long-term reliable electricity for their industry. And because these are so small, I was looking at some diamond mines in Canada. Their average demand for electricity is over 2 megawatts, so this is a perfect size for them. And because these could be so small and not that much cost total, you start to see that you could actually be privately financing these, and that's what these industries are going to do. They already pay a lot of money for electricity every year, so it makes business sense for them to invest in something like this. I think I already went into all the details on this, but I will touch on the last word of this. So build, own, operate, and remove. And that remove is a key one for, I think, a lot of newcomer countries. That means that either you're going to take back the fuel at the end, or for these really tiny designs, you are probably just going to take back the whole reactor. So if it only takes up the space of a shipping container or a rail car, it's easy for you to come and get that full reactor when it's done and deal with all the messy part of dealing with the fuel at your central facility, which might be in another country. And that kind of limits the number of countries that need to have this kind of sensitive fuel processing equipment and facilities. Okay. So I think the nuclear is a good fit for a lot of countries in Africa, particularly looking at having a lot of growth in energy demand and electricity demand. And I think it's going to play a really important role even in the US and Europe in decarbonizing the global economy. But it can be and has been historically really important in spurring economic growth in developing countries. So we don't want to say, it's only for wealthier countries. I think security risks and waste can be managed, and some of these new technologies help with that. And the major challenges are really developing that infrastructure, human capital, and financing. And so these technologies that I touched on, they're not ready yet. We're just sort of building the first ones in the US right now. But I think that gives us time to get the conversation going around newcomer countries of what exactly would you want from a nuclear power plant? What size would you want? What technology would you want? What are you skeptical of? What help do you need from the international community in terms of financing, infrastructure? I think there's time now, since these aren't ready today, to sort of get all that infrastructure and conversation going now, so that when they're ready for buying out of a catalog, your country will be ready to buy them if they want to. And that is it. And there's my contact information.
Jessica's probably a bit jet lagged. She's gotten off a plane and it's supposed to be 9 a.m. where she's coming from. So another round of applause for her, please. Quickly piggyback on what you just touched on as far as the technologies not being available in even in the US yet. How long do you think it'll take to get to this part of the world?
Yeah, and I talk a lot with the companies that are developing these designs, and they are looking at export markets.
Okay.
Because that's where the growth in electricity demand is. But they're definitely going to be building first in the U.S. And that's something, when I've talked to different newcomer countries, that I hear a lot is like, yeah, this technology sounds cool, but we don't want to be a guinea pig. Like, we don't want to build the first one. And that's a great point. I don't think
Makes sense.
I don't think you would want to take that risk. The U.S. has a lot of infrastructure to handle riskier technologies, and particularly nuclear. We have a lot of special facilities to handle accidents and things like that. So when they will be ready, it's happening a lot faster than we thought. Sort of industry is farther ahead than the government thought. And so we're getting the first builds are coming up in the next few years. So the company that's farthest along in the U.S. is NewScale. And they have a 50 megawatt reactor, but you build it in packs, like a 6-pack or a 12-pack. So it starts to look the size of maybe a natural gas plant, but because the individual reactors are factory produced, it's a lot cheaper. And they're starting construction in 2023 on their first commercial plant in the U.S. So I think a lot of people are excited, but also want to wait and see how that goes. You know, does it get built on budget? Does it operate? You want to go and tour it and see it. And I think once it's operating, they're going to be using that as a site to bring in a lot of people from other countries that are interested in nuclear to kind of, you know, kick the tires, touch it, get a feel of how it works. And I think once you have that operating, it'll be a lot more feasible for countries to think how it would fit into their grid. For some of the more advanced designs, like the microreactor concepts, because they're so small and actually much simpler in design, they might actually get built sooner because it's easier for them to go through the regulator because they're so small. So there's one company, Oklo, that's actually in California, where I live, and they're building a 2 megawatt reactor that's designed to be road transportable, and it has a lifetime of about 20 years.
Wow.
And they are looking to build their first commercial plant, I would say in about 5 years. So.
Okay, so that's not a few decades away. That's a few years away.
Yeah, and Oklo in particular, their design is going to be, I'll just say, too expensive for the grid in the U.S., but they're not looking at the utility grid market. They're looking at off-grid applications. So these mining sites, these diesel-dependent communities, and I think that's where there might be a really good fit of, you know, once they start building them on the assembly line, the cost is going to come down, but the first ones are going to be built for customers, particularly for industries, probably likely in Canada, that are willing to pay more, but then it starts to bring that cost down and also bring sort of the risk down once these get built.
All right, that's quite interesting. Given that nuclear at this point is not considered clean energy, what sorts of financing instruments are available that will make this conversation a little bit more interesting? Because if you think about numbers of when you compare other energy sources to what nuclear is, those numbers are still not in the same ballpark.
Yeah, and having good financing really helps get these projects going, and also brings down the cost. You saw financing is such a big component of the cost. So typically, how these have been financed, particularly, I didn't mention this, but for what we call nuclear newcomer countries, that's a country building its first nuclear power plant. Historically, they've imported their first reactor. That just makes sense. when you're getting started. So whether it was coming from the US or France, or now it's more likely South Korea or Russia, you're going to import that first plant, and that's traditionally come with financing. So for example, Russia is offering very generous financing if you partner with them on a nuclear project. Depends on the country. South Korea has an export bank, so a bank that helps them export projects. And so that's likely where financing would come from. And even the US, our Export-Import Bank had some restrictions on nuclear projects that we're working to get removed because, as I said, there's all these companies in the US that are developing really cool, very exportable nuclear power projects, but they need help with that financing because the US government doesn't offer such supportive financing the way that Russia or China might. But some of the big things that are missing, if you don't have that state support, as I mentioned, a lot of these multilateral banks or international financing institutions have prohibitions on funding nuclear, but they're really outdated. They're from the 60s and 70s. They don't reflect current technology, and so we're working on sort of changing that perception, particularly in the light of climate change. We need a lot of clean energy. These organizations say they want to fund clean energy, but they're funding, very small things. So looking at changing those policies would really help more countries be sort of capable of hosting a nuclear power plant and also bringing down that total cost.
That's quite interesting to think through the financial mechanisms of something like that. If you look at Nigeria, for example, we have two nuclear plants that we've signed up for in Itu and in Geregu. Those are supposed to cost around $10 billion to build. The annual budget of the country is about 2 or 3 times that amount. So that kind of sets us up for a sovereign risk, depending on who finances it. So for these massive plants, which in the U.S. haven't been completed in almost 20 years, are you seeing a decline globally? And are these small modular reactors now the way forward?
Yeah, we are still seeing some of these really big plants get built. The US has 2 under construction. China has a lot, about 30 under construction, because they still have big growth in energy. So if you're a big industrial country, it might still be worth it for you to invest. And if you have a big nuclear industry like South Korea. But the trick with both in the US and Europe, and I think moving forward in emerging economies, is that you don't have these really big utilities that can finance such a project. So in the US, we have hundreds of utilities, and most of them don't have the budget to finance a big project. So that's why they're looking at the small modular reactors. And I should have said, one of the kind of key ideas about the SMR, so with the NuScale, it's small, but you'd build multiples of them, so it adds up to a big reactor, and that might not sound like it makes a lot of sense because you're going to end up spending the same amount of money, but the key is you get that first module in maybe just a year or 2, and then you can turn it on, start generating electricity, start generating revenue while you wait for the second one to come in and the third one. So you just start making a profit earlier, and the upfront investment is much less before you start generating revenue, so that's a much easier model for smaller utilities and smaller countries to follow. And while you still may need eventually a lot of electricity, a lot of capacity, maybe on the order of gigawatts, you can build it much more in sort of smaller steps. And so I think it is easier to finance. And so that's why you've seen so much of the industry move towards small modular reactors. Even China is putting a lot into small modular reactors. They're building really big plants, but they're also looking at small modular reactors for export. Same with South Korea. And the US obviously has a lot. But that's sort of where the global industry is moving, is towards much smaller plants. Again, I think the big idea is moving nuclear from projects to products. So more like buying a car, buying a gas turbine, and less like building a national highway system, which is what nuclear is more like today.
And during your presentation, you talked through about Russia doing build, own, and more or less operate, more or less using power as a service.
Yeah.
That model seems, in my opinion, seems a little bit more attractive because it does not require as much financial constraints. Do you think more African countries will go that direction, or do you think they'll go back to the original model?
No, I think more countries are going in that direction. And I think really even for a country that already has nuclear, a country that has a good regulator, it's a good direction to go in because it puts more of the risk on the vendor side, on the company side. And a lot of these, the reason a lot of these reactors are getting really, really small is it makes that model easier. And so I think that's a better model to go down. And the thing is, if you really want to localize the technology and grow your domestic industry in the space, you can still do that. And a lot of countries in the past, even China and South Korea both imported their first several reactors. And then they sort of worked slowly to kind of start operating them, and then they started doing part of the construction, and now they're doing all the construction, and now they're exporting them and building them in other countries. So it doesn't have to be we're either going to do it ourselves or we're going to have a foreign company do it. You can start with a foreign company and then build up your own expertise and your own industry while you're doing it. Or like a few countries in Eastern Europe, they just imported reactors and they're just running for 40 years and they're not doing anything domestically. Kind of what makes sense for you.
Okay, interesting. A few more questions before we go to audience participation. I think of the logical comparison here in Nigeria is between solar and nuclear. The radiation levels here in Nigeria are the same as in Southern California, which has a couple thousand megawatts of solar generation. As far as cost and as far as environmental impact and the quality of power, how does these small reactors, how do they compare to solar?
So I think even the smallest, the smallest nuclear power plant that we can imagine, probably 1 megawatt, is still much bigger than a solar panel, even than a solar farm. I think some of the largest solar farms are just getting into a few megawatts, maybe 10 megawatts. A solar panel, even per unit of capacity, so per megawatt, is much cheaper than nuclear. Okay. That's just a fact. But it generates electricity a lot less of the time. So even in a country like Nigeria or a place like California where I live, with really good sunshine, you might only get electricity coming out of that solar panel 20% of the time. Mm-hmm. Obviously not at night, but also when it's cloudy. And what that means is over the lifetime it generates a lot less electricity, so the cost of electricity is more comparable. Now solar is still cheaper, but the big issue is intermittency. So one of the major issues, it's not just that you don't know when it's going to produce, because you can predict it, in the middle of the day you're going to get a lot of solar panel, is that it all comes at once. And this is true for solar and also for wind, is that when the wind's blowing, it's blowing everywhere in the whole region. And you start to see this in countries countries or states that have a lot of wind or a lot of solar. You get these huge surges and it's really hard on the grid. So for example, I was living in Australia for 6 months last year. Australia, particularly South Australia, has a ton of solar panel, particularly rooftop. And the challenge is that when you get these really sunny days around noon, there's too much solar, and it causes a lot of transformers on the grid to trip. So you have these big power outages caused by too much sun. And there's ways to work around that. You can make the grid better, you can put a lot of investments in. But what generally happens, and this is what happens in California, where we have on a sunny day, we might have 50% of our electricity coming from solar, is that you get a lot of curtailment. So that means you have to protect the grid, you just have to turn off those panels. So they're still collecting sunlight, but it's not making electricity because there's just too much of it. Okay. So you need to have a balance. And I think what we're seeing with these smaller nuclear is that they could be a really good partner for renewables. They can do the base load. You can have a good share of solar and wind, and maybe definitely some natural gas in there to balance out the in-between. But having really high penetrations of one type of generation, particularly if it's intermittent, can be really challenging from a grid management perspective.
Okay. That's interesting. I think a point you made in your presentation was that the United Emirates are building four nuclear plants, more or less showing that they've got a lot of sunlight, but they're now adapting to a different technology. I think for us in Nigeria, we have a few issues with the grid, right? So with these issues, there's been some thoughts around going to smaller mini grids and microgrids. Your presentation focused a bit on microgrids towards the end. If we were to get this in Nigeria, what's the average cost? And how, I guess, let's just start with the cost.
The cost of the micro
Yes.
reactor? Okay. So right now, kind of first of a kind cost, so this is a demonstration, is looking at, I would say, $10,000 per kilowatt. So I think that comes out to 10 million per megawatt.
That's not cheap.
That's not cheap. So what these are aiming at, their first markets, as I mentioned, are looking at diesel-dependent industries that are off-grid. And for them, the actual cost to generate electricity is probably a tenth of what they're paying now.
Oh, wow.
So you say it's not cheap, but if you're, in far northern Canada running a diamond mine, you're paying a lot for diesel electricity, and so these are cheap. The nuclear microreactors are very cheap. Now, the idea is that once you start building them on an assembly line and get, tens or hundreds of these, they will come down and be cost competitive with, solar, gas, and things like that. But we need to see that happen.
Okay.
And, you can look at other industries like airlines. Boeing, when they release a new aircraft like the 787, they price it below what it costs for them to make it. And they assume that after maybe 500 aircraft, that's when they're going to start breaking even, and then they're going to get below that, and it's going to balance out. But they're selling their first few hundred aircraft at a loss.
Okay.
And so we might see something similar with reactors, or we might see that the first ones they sell are going to customers that are willing to pay a lot more because it's worth it for them.
Okay. So my last question, before I come to the audience, is around capacity building. What's the model for capacity building that other countries have tried? Because I feel like that's going to be a very important issue here in Africa.
You mean human capacity?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, so I think there's a few different models, particularly from the big vendor countries, which I wish included the US, but doesn't. So particularly Russia, China, and South Korea. And what they do is if there's a country that they want to sell a nuclear power plant to, they do a lot of help in the human capacity building. So they have worker training where they bring people to Russia, to South Korea to train on the types of reactors they would build. They do a lot of graduate fellowships to study, nuclear engineering, do PhDs there. But because they already have these reactors operating in their country, it's very makes a lot of sense to bring workers to your country to actually train on the real thing and build up that capacity. But I think so. That's if you're a vendor country, that's how you would kind of help with that process. I think there could be a lot more effort multilaterally to kind of help with this effort in training workers. So whether it's several countries coming together to do more training in newcomer countries to get them prepared, because particularly, again, I have a U.S. bias of, I think the U.S. really has an interest in helping countries, grow their energy supply, particularly for clean energy. And so anything they can do to to help more in having that process be equitable, and also just keep the U.S. engaged, so it's not just Russia and China doing all the nuclear builds.
Okay, interesting. All right, let's go to the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand. I see one in the back. So we'll take around 5 questions, and we'll come to you for comments. Please keep your questions short. If you have a comment, make it brief so we can move on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emeka. Nice one, Jessica. Great presentation. My name is Valentine. I'm an analyst here at Nextier. So I would like to know, aside the cost of setting up a nuclear plant in Nigeria, because I know even as far back as 1942, when the first nuclear reactor was set up in the US, and codenamed the Manhattan Project, several billions of dollars were spent as far back as that time. So I'd like to know what would be the implication for Nigeria in setting up a nuclear industrial complex? That's what I'm talking about, a nuclear industrial complex in terms of research and developing nuclear technologies, not just Nigeria being a place for dumping or a marketplace basically for nuclear, but developing a research and development industry.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Senator Yorubu. I'm a media personality. My own concern is the issue of safety, because there have been a lot of safety issues when it comes to nuclear technology. And you are here encouraging that it should be a model. We have Fukushima, we've had Chernobyl, and the issue of the crossbreed went from safe nuclear energy to weaponizing the nuclear technologies. It's the issue of concern. So I think I want you to really address the safety issues for why you're encouraging the countries. What are the safety measures?
Thank you. Thank you. Good question.
Good evening. My name is Mohammed Baba. My question is with a statement I heard you said when you are trying to compare solar energy with nuclear energy. I didn't see you emphasize the fact that solar energy now comes with a storage system. And you were talking about the solar energy example you were stating so far was the one that is called grid connected without storage. So I in particular, I'm an electrical engineer, and I've been advocating for solar energy with storage. If we are told we are going to adopt solar in Nigeria, large scale implementation. I still believe that Africa is not ready for nuclear power station. We have not exhausted our options of solar energy. That's my question.
Thank you, Jessica and Emeka. I like the statement you made when you started that we have not utilized our existing assets and we want to bring in nuclear. I think it costs about $1 million per megawatt to generate on thermal. And if nuclear is going to be 10 million, that's 10 times. So the question is, do we have ready financiers to invest? Because the privatization has got a lot of investors who have, in the last 5 years, have not even broken even. So if you're saying, let us bring in a system that is $10 million, 10 times more, do we have people who are going to loan us this money? And even if they are available, do we have the customers? Because in the power sector, the money comes from the customers. So do we have off-takers who are readily available to take this energy and take it at this cost?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Aiba Matthew. I want to really look at waste disposal. Have you thought of if we have places to dump the waste? Because I can see other countries, Japan in particular now, are looking for where to dispose their waste. Where do we dump this waste? In Nigeria here, I think there are safety concerns.
All right, so we'll go to you, Jessica. I really like your question because even on the solar side, there's a few issues around batteries. After they're used, there's nowhere to dump them, and they end up in our streams and in different places. So maybe you can give us some answers.
Yeah, I think we hit on all the major concerns around nuclear that people have. So those are great questions. So I think the first one, if I'm remembering the order correctly, was around safety. And I think definitely if you were looking at the really large 1 gigawatt light water reactors that we have around the world today, they take very strong regulators doing inspections and a very well-trained workforce, and they're very safe. You know, if you look at the US, very good safety record. I trust them. I would live next to one. But it takes a lot of effort, and that capacity takes a long time to build up. So I would not expect a plant like that to get built soon, and I would have more concerns about it operating in a country that doesn't have a lot of experience on the safety side. So that's why I focused on these new designs. Particularly, if you notice, none of them really use water as the coolant. They're all what we say is passively safe, so they cool themselves if they get too hot, using natural physical processes, kind of like convection, so they can be cooled by air. So you really, there's not a way to have the type of accident that we've seen at these large pressurized light water reactors like Chernobyl and Fukushima. So that's why I would be a lot more comfortable deploying these new technologies in newcomer countries that might not have that experience regulating a complex system like that. And also because they're so small, it's a lot easier to manage, so the safety. And on terms of, I think you also mentioned weapons proliferation. For newcomer countries, so the real risk for weapons proliferation comes in fuel handling. So whether you're enriching fuel, which means getting it to the right level for a nuclear reactor, or reprocessing fuel, which is where you're kind of recycling it to be used again, that's where bad things can happen in terms of weapons. And so for newcomer countries, it's very likely, and I think it would probably be required in a lot of these countries, is that there'd be no fuel handling in country. So you'd have the fuel manufactured maybe in Russia, maybe in France, maybe in the US. For these microreactors, the reactor comes with the fuel and it's sealed so you can't get into it. And it just runs for 10 to 30 years and then they take it back. And I think that it's not just safer, it just opens up a lot more places where you can build it and not have to worry about weapons proliferation, about safety concerns. And that also, just to jump a little bit in the questions with regards to waste, I think it's very similar for newcomer countries. You probably wouldn't be disposing of the waste domestically. Russia is looking to take back waste. I think US firms that are doing build, own, operate would likely do the very same thing, because it means you can build a nuclear power plant sooner in a lot of places, because you don't have to have them set up, a waste management system, find a place to put it. There's also a lot of interest from countries that have experience in nuclear, like Australia and the US, in setting up a multilateral or international facility for waste. So maybe the place that gets talked about is actually Southern Australia, hosting an international facility where they would take back waste, not for free, you'd pay money to send it there, because they have a lot of experience handling uranium, and they also have very stable geology, so you can kind of put it out there and it's safe. So newcomer countries wouldn't be responsible for dealing with that waste. But also, Something I didn't really touch on with a lot of these advanced reactors is that they use fuel much more sustainably. So they use recycled fuel. Something a lot of people don't know is that for a typical, these 1 gigawatt light water reactors, when the fuel comes out after 2 years, so the fuel lasts 2 years, you take it out, 96% of the energy is still in the fuel. So you only use about 4% of the energy that's in there. We won't go into the nuclear science reasons why that is, but most of the energy is still in the fuel. And that is a big waste. It's also what makes the waste dangerous. There's a lot of heat in there. So what France does and what Japan does is they recycle all their fuel. They use it a second time. They get a lot more energy out, and they also reduces the amount of waste, the volume, and also how long it's dangerous for. But there are ways in a lot of these advanced reactor designs are using different kinds of fuel so that you can keep recycling it over and over again until you get close to 100% of the energy out. And it also means you don't have to keep mining fuel because you're using it over and over again. In the US, we have over 70,000 tons of nuclear waste from our commercial system. And most of that's a lot of waste, but it's also a lot of energy that we could get out of it. If we were actually recycled it, US doesn't recycle waste. If we actually did recycle it, put it back in reactors, we could power all of the US's electricity for about 500 years. So we just have that sitting there in these sort of concrete casts. And so that's why a lot of these advanced reactor technologies are looking at smarter, different ways to use that, what is waste, and get energy out of it rather than just, putting in a parking lot.
So what does the U.S. do with their waste? You just store it?
Yeah, we just, most waste in the U.S., actually, all waste in the U.S. is stored on site at the power plant.
Okay.
It really is, if you visit a nuclear power plant in the U.S., it looks like there's a parking lot and you have these big concrete kind of cylinders that have the spent fuel inside. And it's very safe. You can walk up, touch them, but they would like a more permanent solution. But we're working on it.
That's quite interesting. Mr. Mohammed had a question on storage, and Val had a question on the implications of the research bit of it.
Yes, I can't remember that question, but I remember the solar question. So yeah, storage is a really exciting industry, really booming, particularly, I come from California. We have a lot of grid scale battery storage getting started. Right now it's really expensive, but we're building more of it, it's coming down, and that's definitely helping with the intermittency. But I think still when you have the amount that you can store, that helps with sort of hourly, minute variations, even daily. But when you get to kind of monthly or seasonal variations, which are not so much a concern in a really sunny place like here, but if you have a few weeks that are cloudy, having a battery that can store that much electricity for a whole country or for a whole region is not practical. So I think batteries can definitely expand the range of how much solar you can have on a grid, because it helps with that short-term variation. But for longer term, you end up building out, if you need 10 megawatts, you have to build 40 or 50 megawatts to be able to cover those longer periods without solar. But it's definitely helping, and it's definitely going in tandem with other technologies that we need. Things like demand response, which is when you don't have enough electricity, maybe you can turn off certain industries or cut back in certain places to help manage the grid. So there's a lot of new innovations like that that kind of go hand in hand with renewables and storage. You can also, if you have more electric vehicles on the grid, you can start using them as storage, and that's great. But in terms of large scale, you really need that baseload electricity. And when you're thinking of productive uses of energy, like factories, manufacturing facilities, you need that 24-hour generation. And there are some issues with batteries around voltage, and whether you can do sort of high voltage applications becomes more challenging. You just lose a lot of energy. It's definitely doable, It just becomes a lot more expensive if you have to convert to higher voltages.
Okay. There was one question around the financial risk of gas being about 1-to-1 and nuclear is about 10-to-1.
Yeah, you shouldn't build a nuclear power plant that's 10 times more expensive. I think the projects you've been offered here from Rosatom are maybe 2,000 per kilowatt, so 2 million per megawatt. But again, that sounds twice as expensive, but when you look at the per kilowatt hour cost, it's actually competitive with gas and with solar because it generates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So definitely should be looking at the full economics of the project, and there are options that are cost competitive today. But I think where these really tiny reactors, again, it's for off-grid industries, and I would even still wait until they come down in cost, because they are going to come down in cost, just like car manufacturing. But you probably don't want to build the first one if you're concerned about financing that.
Awesome. All right, let's get another round of questions. We have one. Here.
Talk. I was just wondering, when do you think there will be either environmental pressure, international pressure, to make that change and swap the base load from gas or coal to nuclear, particularly within Africa and potentially globally as well?
Okay. There's two here.
My name is Chinedu Onyebula. I wanted to find out what would be, I just wanted to get a cost comparative. What would be the running cost over the lifespan of a nuclear plant, just to use it to gauge if it makes sense over time too? Because gas could be cheaper upfront, but then over time too, the running costs add up.
Okay. There's one behind him.
Okay, hi, my name is Nonso Obikili. I must confess, most of my knowledge about nuclear energy comes from watching the TV show Chernobyl. So I'm worried about the disaster. And yes, with big power plants, you have very few disasters that are epic, but very few. But with the proliferation of smaller plants, you would expect to have maybe the same probability of disaster, but you expect to see a bit more disasters. Just statistically, right? And yes, each disaster will be much smaller than the big epic Chernobyl, but I'm wondering how small is small. So for one of these 50 megawatt microreactors, for example, how much of an area will be affected, hypothetically, if there was a disaster? Can you give some kind of measure of the size of an area that will be affected?
Interesting.
I think it's kind of similar to Chinedu's question. During your presentation, you mentioned that in the long run, it becomes cheaper. And I'm wondering what the long run is. Is it like 5 years, 10 years? And by cheaper, by what magnitude does it become cheaper? Yeah.
I feel like my mic's not on anymore.
Let's switch.
Can you hear me? Okay. So all of my cost numbers are in cents per kilowatt hour. Does that work for you? Okay. Yeah. So for existing nuclear power in the U.S. And similar for Europe, it's one of the cheapest sources of electricity that we have. This is just, their cost to generate electricity. It's about 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's the only thing cheaper is existing hydro, which is maybe 1 cent per kilowatt hour. Whereas you have coal and gas coming in more at 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So for new nuclear, by longer term, what I mean is sort of for the lifetime of the project or the plant, which when we do the cost calculation, we look at how long the loan is for the project. So if it's a 20-year loan, you look over 20 years. And for nuclear, for these projects, it comes out to about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. For these microreactors, again, because they're looking at off-grid applications, it's more like 15 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. But that is about half the cost of diesel for off-grid. So that's what the cost looks like. And I will say, in terms of long-term thinking, If you look at places that have a lot of nuclear, like France, or Sweden, they have the cheapest electricity in Europe. If you look at places that don't have nuclear, their electricity is a lot more expensive, and it's because of these long-term things. Hydro, the same. If you have a lot of hydro, you have cheap electricity. So that's that point. In terms of safety, so we can go into more of the details if you'd like, but what I will say is the big difference, just to put it simply, is that none of these reactors are pressurized. So the problem overall with light water reactors, like Chernobyl, like Fukushima, is that they were very highly pressurized, sort of 1,000, 2,000 times atmospheric pressure. And you can think of that as if you puncture it somewhere, everything's shooting out. So all of okay. Oh, there's that mic back there. So all of these reactors are not pressurized, and so what that means is you kind of have, I like to think of it as like a boiling pot of soup, and you can have the lid off, and the soup doesn't go anywhere. And you can make the pot a little taller, so even if it's boiling, it's okay. And if you turn off the heat, it's just going to cool on its own. And there's other features in there where if it gets too hot because of the physics and the neutronics, it actually starts to shut down just naturally when it gets too hot. So you can't have those type of accidents, but you still want to have safety measures in place and really prove that that's the case. So in terms of the area affected, so in the US, we have very strict regulations on nuclear safety, and one thing that we require is that you have an emergency planning zone around a nuclear power plant. That means we have a plan in place for the sort of 20 kilometers around a plant, where if there's an accident, we know how to inform everyone how to evacuate them. Now, that's for existing plants. For these new plants, what they're looking at doing is they're asking the regulator, because we don't have that type of risk, can we shrink that area for the emergency planning zone? And that means that we don't have to, it's not possible for us to have an accident that would affect those people, so can we sort of shrink the boundary around who would be impacted from our accident? And there's been a lot of modeling and a lot of studying of the impacts of potential accidents from these EVX plants. And what they've come up with, the regulator has said, has approved that they can have site boundary barriers. So what that means is if there is an accident, there's nothing dangerous crosses the site boundary. So for these really small microreactors, that's your shipping container size. So even though I'm arguing and trying to convince you that there couldn't be a reactor because the fuel, most of the designs, I will just put simply, the fuel can't melt, so you can't have a meltdown, and also because they're not pressurized, it won't go anywhere. But we're very safe, or we're very secure in saying that nothing would go past the site boundary, so on the power plant.
Interesting. There was a question on the environmental pressure to switch.
Yeah, we are, so there's a lot of policies in the US and Europe and Canada around promoting renewable energy for climate reasons, for environmental reasons. So there's a lot of subsidies, tax credits, mandates, things like that. But what's really hurt nuclear is that it doesn't sort of get credit for its environmental benefits. It's really just competing on cost. And it's done okay in a lot of countries in just competing on cost. France built a lot of nuclear in the 70s, not for environmental reasons, but just they needed cheap electricity. So now the question, the policy question that a lot of countries are facing is, can you give nuclear credit? Can it benefit from the same sorts of supports as renewables? And we are starting to see a change there, particularly as policymakers become more concerned about, can we actually meet these climate targets that we've committed to? it's actually really hard to do it without nuclear. If you're just trying to do it with renewables, power a country with as much energy consumption as the US, it's pretty much impossible with just renewables. So starting to change their policies. So some of the ways we've seen that in a lot of states in the US, they have these things called renewable portfolio standards, which is the utility has to get a certain percentage of their electricity from renewables. So 30 states have those. In California, where I'm from, California has changed it to a clean energy standard. So what that means is, right now, California has to get 80% of their electricity from clean energy. So that includes renewables and nuclear. And that's a lot easier to meet. It's still really hard. We only get 30% of our electricity from renewables right now. So you're seeing more states are switching that, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and more countries in Europe are starting to look at that option. So what it does is, it doesn't say, okay, we're going to build a bunch more nuclear overnight, but it says we're putting nuclear on the same sort of benefits playing field as renewables. So if what we care about is low carbon electricity, we should be subsidizing them the same because they have the same clean air benefits. So we're seeing more of that. There's a lot of pressure right now on the EU and on the UN to sort of start treating nuclear like renewables in a lot of these financing mechanisms and clean energy mandates. Because right now when you see like clean energy portfolio, clean energy subsidy, that really just means renewables. And what more countries are starting to question and starting to lobby is to include all sorts of clean energy. So for another example, a lot of these standards don't include large hydro. Like in California, large hydro doesn't count towards our renewable portfolio standard, but it's perfectly renewable.
Yeah.
It's just that it's big, which, you know, if we're going to try and decarbonize our whole economy, we need a lot of big energy plants. So there's a lot of change happening there, and particularly there's pressure from some of the big nuclear countries, like China, a lot of their decarbonization is going to come through nuclear. So it's changing, but it was confusing for a long time.
Interesting. All right, so if you look up on the board behind you or in front of you, there's a website that has a code and it has one short question for you to answer.
I'm Nalin. Can I talk sitting down or stand down? Okay, I'm Nalin Chichi Igu and I'm the energy advisor for USAID.
Yes.
And I guess the reason why people don't accept, or why it's difficult for people to accept nuclear energy as a clean tech energy is really because of the issues around the waste degradation. We know it does take thousands of years sometimes for some of the waste to fully degrade. And we know that all it will take is an act of God or probably an act of man like terrorism for issues like Fukushima and Chernobyl to happen all over again. So that being said, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I heard you say that there's a technology that produces almost no waste. Could you touch more on that? And why is the R&D, research and development, not focusing on that kind of technology?
My name is Dr. Sue Egobemian. I work with Nextier as well. So 2 things. First off, a comment. I want to ride on your response to the safety issues that could be associated with nuclear power and how it has been addressed up until now. So I want to assume that nuclear power is actually safe enough to be used to power agricultural environments. If I'm wrong, you can correct me on that. Then secondly, a question. So assuming Nigeria has decided that, all right, fine, we are going to adopt nuclear power for electrification, what will be the very first step to enable the environment in this area, considering our own regulatory environment, considering the political environment, considering the social environment?
Jessica, I have a question. While you were trying to tell us about the benefit and the challenges, you talked about that we actually need a good and stable governance. And considering the kind of conflict we have here, and I think having a nuclear reactors everywhere would be an issue. If any of the terrorist group gets into there, we'll be in a situation. Then the second one, which I wanted you to answer, I know that India and Pakistan use only 5% of the nuclear energy they've amassed. 1972, when Pakistan first got their first nuclear plant, it was like everybody was like, what was going to happen? And thirdly, they mined uraniums. How would this affect, ecological balance in Africa if, let's say, Nigeria decides to say, okay, nuclear, here we come. We have an issue of ecology already, and doubling it, don't you think it would be an issue?
Thank you.
Two brief questions. What's the implications for the grid if they were providing large-scale nuclear? And what's the supply chain for uranium like? And how is that affecting?
Sir.
The name is Mohammed Baba again. Sorry, I want to believe that so far the nuclear technology we've been talking about is the nuclear fission, one of separation. We also have another technology called nuclear fusion technology. And I know there has been a lot of research and development on that. I watched a lot of TED Talk on this nuclear fusion thing. And just as she is saying there, why is the level, where are we now all over about nuclear fusion? Because that doesn't create any waste and it cannot be weaponized. So that is my question.
Great question. So just to jump on your point, I had said that nuclear produces no emissions. So by that I meant air emissions, so greenhouse gases or carbon. In terms of waste, it does, you do have this spent fuel left over. And I think you mentioned there is waste from batteries. And I think the question of mining is not just for nuclear. I mean, the materials in solar panels and wind turbines, those all are mined. For solar panels, a lot of it is mined in China. They don't have good controls on the pollution there for that. And then you do have to do something with solar panels when at the end of their life, and we don't really have recycling systems in place for those now. It's not the same. Nuclear waste is very sensitive, and you need to control it. So in terms of I think what really turned me on nuclear, I didn't start out just promoting nuclear. I started out focused on renewables, is looking at the health impacts of all energy technologies. So, you might have one of these big nuclear disasters, like Fukushima and Chernobyl, but, in Fukushima, it was very scary, it was very expensive, but no one died from the radiation. Whereas around the world, you have hundreds of thousands of deaths from coal pollution every year, and that's just sort of accepted. I don't think it should be accepted. I think we should be, more worried. We should be trying harder to reduce that air pollution. But, I think it's a little bit silly to point out the pollution problems of renewables, but they are real, The mining is you're dealing with a lot of toxic chemicals, and it doesn't make renewables exempt from those controls. But it can be managed a lot like uranium mining. So a couple of people asked questions hinting at uranium mining. Likely, the uranium fuel cycle is very international. So it's condensed in just a few countries, mainly Australia, Canada, and Kazakhstan is where most of the world's uranium fuel comes from. And that would be true for nuclear newcomer countries as well. It's very unlikely you'd be doing any mining in sight just because there's a lot of economies of scale with uranium mining. And it's much more economic to just buy it on the national market, likely from France, who gets their uranium from Kazakhstan or Australia. So I think that answers that question. And then with waste, again, we're not doing great now, but I think if you do more recycling, you get that volume down, and you also get the lifetime that it's dangerous down to just tens of years, and the volume down to just sort of 1% of what it is today. So like a lot of issues, recycling is the answer. What's that? Did I miss a topic? Oh, great question. Yeah, so there's a rule of thumb that you don't want any power plant to be more than 10% of the grid's capacity. And what that means is all countries in Africa that would rule out a 1 gigawatt reactor, except for South Africa. Now, if you get down to smaller reactors, a few hundred megawatts, then the grid could accommodate those. Something else that could be done is having a nuclear power plant that's managed by several countries, or they share the power. You see this happen more with hydro, where the electricity gets sold to multiple countries. You could see that with if you really wanted to do a larger nuclear power plant, doing it kind of on the border and shared. Malaysia and Singapore might do something like that with a nuclear power plant. But yeah, definitely the grid needs to be large enough to accommodate, but one thing that is nice about a nuclear power plant is that because it runs 24/7, it's easier for the grid to handle because it keeps up that 50 hertz momentum that kind of keeps the grid humming, so you don't have those ups and downs. So it's a little bit easier for the grid to handle, but you do still need a big grid to accommodate it.
Interesting. All right, there's a question back there.
Oh, fusion. Okay, we'll come back.
Okay, well, why don't you take that?
Okay, fusion. There's been a lot of R&D around fusion energy because it's so promising if we could get it to work, but it's always sort of decades away. Ever since the 1940s, it's been sort of on the horizon. That's eventually, in this utopian future that we have, will be powered by fusion. Just in the last 5 years, there's been a lot of breakthroughs in actually getting it to work. And in particular, in the US, there are several privately funded startups working on fusion that are looking to they sort of have technology milestones that they need to meet, but they have a timeline for how they're going to meet them. So I'm not saying it's for sure yet that it's going to work, but we'll know, I think, in the next few years whether that's a doable technology at a commercial scale. We can make fusion happen left and right in the lab, but making it work out sustainably for electricity production, I think we're very close. We have some big companies working on that, like Lockheed Martin. Some of our big defense contractors are looking at doing fusion.
My name is Uche Chukwu. I'm a publisher. I just want to make a comment. I opened a poll, and the poll is saying whether Africa is ready for nuclear power. My worry is that we, Africa, I don't know the part of Africa they are talking about for the nuclear power, but it's a pity that we, Africans, like to copy trends. We like to follow what is going on without assessing ourselves properly. It's like somebody that doesn't have a network in his village trying to buy recent iPhone 11. Because we don't have electricity, the simplest thing in the whole world. We don't have power, and we're talking about nuclear power. That is too expensive. Even the US cannot afford it easily. And let us know this is not issue for Africa. Nuclear power is not issue for Africa. We should go and face our commonest problem.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
So, okay, let me just land. In nutshell, Africa should stop following trends. There are some certain things that are not meant for us. We should go and solve our problem.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yusuf. I work with Nextier. So I would like to know if Africa is really ready, if we are ready for nuclear. So is nuclear, is it incorporated into the existing grid, or is it made available as an off-grid alternative source of energy?
Thank you very much. My name is Laiwola. My question is this. I believe that for Africa too, we need a mix, the energy mix, both nuclear and every other thing. But you see, I don't know. I want you to provide probably solution to how do we convince our people? Because the truth of the matter is the risk involved is what is scaring everybody.
So how do you, for instance, I work for government, how do I convince the people outside there and government that, look, it's safe or the risk can be contained and, what have you? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeremiah Mbazo. I'm from the Nigerian Young Generation in Nuclear. So the questions being raised here are very pertinent to an event that is taking place currently in Abuja here. Perhaps some people are aware of it. So, no? Okay. Maybe you should come tomorrow to Ritz Continental Hotel to get more details. So when you talk about nuclear, back to the question now. When you talk about nuclear, some people are quite novice about it. They don't know what it's all about. Nuclear is what keeps us alive, essentially. So sometimes people have fears. I wouldn't say it's unfounded, but it's a little bit out of ignorance, if I may say. Nuclear energy is what we have presently, because the sun, it's out of nuclear. We are living in a pool of radiation going around us. So I'm wondering, what are people really afraid of? Like, is it because they don't know the details, or just because they want to be afraid? Okay, so that's aside. Coming to nuclear, if Africa is ready for nuclear energy, as my co-commenter or questionnaire talked about, I would say that nuclear has been in existence or in application to generating electricity since 1945, since the Chicago pool generated its first chain reaction. So it's been applied for a very, very long time. So it's been tested, tried, very reliable, safe. If you take account of the nuclear accident that has been happening in the world, the first one is the 3 Mile Island in the 70s, and then the Chernobyl, and then the last one in the Fukushima, 2011. If you want to take account of the real direct effects of these casualties to people, they are very, very minimal. Maybe 1 or 2 people that had the direct impact or that died directly as a result of the accident. So, but every day you have the road, some of these crazy drivers going along the road, accidents happen, and the people that even come to rescue them use the same road, you see? So, not being afraid of what happened. So, maybe I'm sounding like defensive of nuclear, but it's,
of course not.
I think it's being objective about nuclear energy. It's not like leapfrogging. It's something that we need in Africa. We've been shouting of infrastructural deficit and whatever in Africa and in Nigeria especially. I think if we want to make...
Hey, one house.
Thank you. Okay, so the question is, what do we need to do to get nuclear energy, and not, are we ready? Thank you.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so I did want to hop on. I think there's a lot of questions about public perception and if people are too afraid or not ready. And I think a point I want to make that maybe wasn't clear is if the public won't accept it, then you shouldn't build it. And so one of the first steps in having nuclear power is you need to build trust with the community, particularly where a power plant might be. And if you don't have that trust from that community, you shouldn't build a power plant there. And that's true for any type of project. And so for some of these new technologies, you don't want the first of a kind to be here. So you want to be able to somehow go, have your policymakers or your regulators go and visit these plants in other countries, bring that experience back, and educate people on the option, not to force it upon them, but to say, here's what we learned, here's what we think, and now you can make up your own mind. And that's why I do think probably one of the first customers, if some of these countries in Africa would like nuclear, it'll probably be a private customer and not the grid or not a utility. So maybe it's a mining operation that wants to pay for it themselves and operate it themselves, and they're willing to take the risk on their land that they own, or an oil refinery that wants to buy one to power that. I think a private customer might make more sense because they can make that decision for themselves if they want to take that risk or not, and also finance it themselves.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name's Jim Howlett. I was just interested in your comment there about you thought that perhaps the first customer in sub-Saharan Africa was going to be private. At the start of the session, Emeka mentioned that there were 2 plants that Nigeria had signed up for.
Mm-hmm.
How far would you say Nigeria is away from those plants being commissioned?
Okay.
I work with Fallen Energy Magazine. The truth is, you can't shy away from the culture and the norms of the people where you are planting these things. If you're talking about Africa, then you are in Nigeria. So let's talk about how it's going to affect Nigeria. And what if tomorrow we start generating power through nuclear? What will America do? Because America is always fighting people producing these nuclear powers. Not North Korea, Russia. Tomorrow they say they are sanctioning them. Won't they come to us and say they want to sanction us for producing just small power to generate power through the nuclear? These are the things that we should think of. Then secondly, the thing you need to think about is the Nigerian factor coming into play. But what might work in South Africa, before it works here, it might take a longer time.
Can you explain the Nigerian factor?
Have you factored the Nigerian factors? One, you have to see the people that knows the president, that knows the president's friend. 2, you have to see the minister that the people that knows the ministers and knows the minister's grandfather. Have you factored those things? Do you think that these things you can work it out in Nigeria beautifully without all these factors holding it down? And we all like good things. The mentioning of nuclear towards Nigeria is a weapon. So how do you think you can go far to convince Nigeria that this thing is pure and is neat?
Interesting. Good evening.
Jessica, nice presentation, though I came late, sorry, but at least I've done my own little research and I've been struggling to ask, because I didn't want to know whether it is a far-fetched or it's out of the discussion. By the way, happy PhD in view, and good luck to you, whatever you study.
All right, so what's your question?
The question now is, just for information basis or for clarity, most of the world is going into blockchain. And the reason why they're going into it is because they've already seen that majority are already hovering around the cryptocurrency, and it has been, there is negative and the positive, but the positive side of it is that it works on the blockchain, and the blockchain is like the internet 2.0. Now, how can you connect nuclear with the blockchain? Thank you.
The question of ready or not ready, I want to remind us that security provisions in Nigeria today have been outsourced. We have many armed groups in different parts of the country. Couple of months ago, a governor in the north visited some armed bandits, and they were making demand for certain issues, and the government have to pay. If you go to the south, to the east, we have different groups. So how are we ready? If today Nigeria decides to build a plant, and it has implication, and maybe one of these armed groups decide to overtake this plant, doesn't it have security implication? I don't think we are ready, please. We're not ready.
Those examples that you gave of the U.S. stopping countries, that all had to do with weapons, not commercial nuclear power. The U.S. actually has done a lot to encourage commercial nuclear power in countries, even countries with security issues, Vietnam, United Arab Emirates. So the U.S., even whether or not they would build the nuclear power plant, something they like to do is sign bilateral agreements around cooperation around nuclear, and that can be around, R&D collaboration or human capacity building. And they have those agreements with several countries in Africa, mostly in North Africa, but also country of South Africa. So I don't think they would try to stop any of these countries. In particular, the thing that they care about is countries doing uranium enrichment and not allowing inspections. As I showed on the map, I don't know if you were here to see that, every country that is interested in nuclear on the African continent has already signed the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and also signed additional protocols. And what additional protocols mean is that you will allow international inspectors to come into any of your facilities, check that everything's going perfectly, nothing's getting stolen, there's nothing happening involving weapons. And so as long as you're signed up for that, the U.S. is perfectly happy for you to be pursuing civilian, commercial, nuclear activities. Okay, I'm trying to remember the other questions. Blockchain. Yeah, there's a lot of work around cybersecurity and nuclear power plants, and I think it's an open space for more work. Something that's interesting around the microreactors is that a lot of them are looking at being autonomous, so they won't have workers on site, so they need really good cybersecurity, not just for preventing something nefarious happening, but also for monitoring the physics inside, the fuel, and things like that. So that sort of R&D is really interesting right now because again, it's not like the nuclear we've had in the past. It's much more high tech and involves a lot of other sectors that are right now sort of outside the nuclear industry, like cybersecurity, like advanced manufacturing, 3D printing, things like that. So bringing in these other innovative sectors into nuclear, which is sort of old-fashioned in some ways, they're building these big steel plants with lots of concrete. So getting them to incorporate more of these high technologies is a challenge, but I think it's going to have to do that in order to move forward.
Okay, and then there was a question on what Nigeria needs to do to get ready.
Yeah. So I just wanted to point out, I think, someone asked about timescale for those big plants. I would say if Rosatom is building them, you could start construction within 10 years if those projects happen. Russia has a lot of agreements with countries that look like this to build a power plant, and we'll see how many of them actually go through, whether they can actually finance a lot of these projects. But to give you an example of how short the timescale can sometimes be, so United Arab Emirates decided they wanted to have a nuclear power plant in 2009. They actually had a study done with all the Gulf states, so Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, looking at what nuclear would do in the region and whether they wanted it. And UAE, and they took bids from a lot of countries for a potential project, and they ended up signing a contract with South Korea to build these 4 1.4 gigawatt plants. So that comes out to about 6 gigawatts of electricity. It's about 20% of the country's electricity when they come online. But the first one comes online this year. So that's about 10 years from, hey, I think we'd like a nuclear power plant, to generating electricity. Now that's a very wealthy country, and something they did, they didn't just, they partnered with South Korea to build the plants. They also signed an agreement with the US to do some worker training, to source the fuel. They didn't just import the technology, they also imported their regulators. So what that means is they hired a lot of people, particularly from the US and Europe, to run the utility, to run the regulator. That's sort of a shortcut you can take if you are worried about human capacity within your own country. But now they're training thousands of workers from the UAE to work at these plants to be the future regulators, but they were able to make that happen so fast because they imported the experts.
Okay, so I guess to wrap up, if you had an opportunity to kind of estimate how long do you think, from your experience and from the various things you've done, will one of these small reactors be active in the continent? How long do you think that'll be?
I think you could definitely see construction start within 10 years.
Okay.
I would say outside of South Africa, the country that's probably closest is actually Ghana, in terms of getting their infrastructure ready and taking bids. And I think you are seeing a lot more interest in North Africa, but in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think Ghana could really be moving on a concrete project within 10 years.
All right, so the good news for Nigeria is we have 10 years to get our act together, right? All right, so we ran a poll, and surprisingly, 30% of you feel that we're ready for nuclear, 45 say no, and 25 say maybe. So, much better than I thought. Let me invite Dr. Dr. Osayu to close us out.
That's pretty short. Good evening, everyone. I'm certain we've thoroughly engaged ourselves in this discourse. I was about to share the polls as well, but Emeka has beaten me to that. 60 seconds, are you sure it's... But the thing with nuclear is that, let me just quickly go through the speed run. To enjoy nuclear in the long term, you have to make sure everything is put in place. You have to plan accordingly, basically. What does it mean by planning accordingly? You have to ensure you secure financing, ensure your grid capacity is up to date or up to the amount. You have to ensure standard regulations are put in place to implement power safely. You have to ensure you train the required workforce, to build, own, and operate these nuclear technologies. And you have to reduce the risk concerning ease of doing business, I think somebody mentioned politics, ease of doing business, politics, security, and others. And the planning starts now. Nigeria's forecasted population for 2050 is about 411 million. That's a big number. And by 2050, you have to have everything in place. You have to ensure you have the right energy mix. Hopefully that includes nuclear into your system to meet the growing demands. A big thank you to Jessica from the Energy for Growth Hub for giving us this presentation. I found it interesting that SMRs, micro reactors, have a wide range of applications, and you can even combine it with renewables such as solar and wind. So on that note, and on behalf of Nextier Power, I would like to extend my appreciation to the moderator, the audience, the Energy for Growth Hub, and the organizing team for this event. Thank you for sharing your evening with us. We extend our gratitude and do have a lovely evening. Thank you.